Well, you can see our title for today, The Betrayed King. And I wonder what comes to your mind when you see that title. Well, let me tell you what came to my mind when I first saw it. I wonder on this next slide, I wonder if you recognize this story. Do you know what story that's from? Well, I think it's from The Lion King, isn't it? This is the original Lion King that I saw. I think there's been a newer one, hasn't there? But this is what I saw when I was younger. And can you remember, do you know who these two characters are? I wonder if you can remember their names. Well, I think the one on the left, he looks a bit fierce, doesn't he? I think that's Mufasa. I think that's right, isn't it? And well, he is the Lion King, isn't he? He's the king of Pride Rock. And I wonder, who's that sneaking fellow on the other side? He looks like he's up to no good, doesn't he? Well, I think that's Scar, isn't it? Yeah, he's not a very nice character, and he's Mufasa's brother, isn't he, if you remember in the story. And can you remember what happens between these two characters in the story as it goes on? Well, if you remember, it's a sad story, isn't it? Because Scar betrays Mufasa, doesn't he? And Mufasa dies. And you can see that picture from the film. Look how happy Scar is that he's going to be the king instead of Mufasa. And if you've watched that film, it's a very sad moment in the film, isn't it, when Scar betrays Mufasa. But you know, sadly, betrayal, it is part of our human experience, isn't it? And there have been lots of stories over the centuries that have explored what betrayal is and what consequences it has for people. Maybe you know Shakespeare's play about Julius Caesar and his assassination. And the worst thing in that play for Caesar is that it's his friend Brutus who's leading the conspirators. And you know, the person of Brutus became a kind of archetypal figure of betrayal. And in the Middle Ages, there was an Italian poet called Dante, and he wrote a long poem which he imagined descending into hell. And in the innermost part, in the ninth circle, in the deepest part of hell, was Brutus and other betrayers. We can see a kind of a weird picture of them here. You know, for Dante, betrayal was the worst of all sins. And if you've ever experienced it, maybe you think he was right. Well, today we're thinking about another story about betrayal, and that's the story from 2 Samuel that was explained by Joanna and read for us. And we're going to think about this story that happened to David. And I hope that we'll see it tells us something about ourselves, but also something about God. Okay, and you can see this is where we're going. So first we're going to think about causes and consequences in this story of Absalom's betrayal. And then we'll look at a history of betrayal. And then, well, I've put betrayal's end. That's a question. Okay, so let's look at causes and consequences. Now, just before we launch into this, I just feel I need to say that this story is very long. The story in 2 Samuel of Absalom that Joanna outlined, it's a very long story and it's a very complicated story. And I was really struck in preparing, reading and rereading the story, just how much it has to say about this topic of betrayal. And this morning, we're not even really scratching the surface. So I'd really encourage you to, if you have time later, to read the whole story, because it has a lot to teach us about betrayal and its consequences. But for today, let's begin. And let me ask you a question at the beginning. What do you think about Absalom? Well, what can we say from the passages that we've just read? Well, he was obviously a very, as we'd say today, clever politician, wasn't he? And he was also someone who was prepared to use other people for his own ends, and of course, even betray his own father in pursuit of power. So, was Absalom just a ruthless politician? Was he just power hungry? Was he just a bad person? When people do terrible things, there are always reasons, aren't there? And if you were to read, Joanna helpfully outlines some of this story. If you were to read in chapter 13 and 14 of 2 Samuel, you see that Absalom has well, a complicated personal history. And his family situation is also, well, dysfunctional. And his relationship with his father David is, well, troubled, not exactly straightforward. And it's interesting to think about how Absalom's history shapes his character to become the person who can even betray his own father. And this is interesting because part of the complication in Absalom's history is a result of David's own actions. If you were here a few weeks ago, perhaps you remember Ed was helping us to think about the story where David captured the city of Jerusalem and really became established securely as the king over all of Israel. And if you remember that passage, you might remember how it ends. Do you remember how it ends by saying that David took many wives and concubines, even though this was clearly against God's commands in the law? And David's disobedience, not to mention his adultery with Bathsheba that we thought about last week, that disobedience led to this very complicated family dynamic and the strife that broke out in his family, and so indirectly at least to Absalom's betrayal. So I think there's a lesson here already, isn't there, which is if we live contrary to God's will and design, there are always consequences, aren't there? There's a verse in the book of Numbers that says, "Be sure your sins will find you out." So let me respectfully ask you this. Are you living in a way that's contrary to God's will? Are you living, sinning against God in some area of your life? Well, if you are, don't be naive and think that you can do that without there being consequences. And as with David, sometimes consequences might not just hurt you, they might hurt lots of people around you. Well, that's a bit about causes. What about consequences? What were the consequences of Absalom's betrayal for David? Well, on the one hand, it's kind of a political story, this, isn't it? And we see how lots of people, even some of David's closest advisors, maybe even friends, they turned against David, didn't they? Presumably, they hoped that they'd get more power in Absalom's new regime. And actually, David, do you remember how he felt he had to leave the city of Jerusalem? If you remember that, if you were here for the Ed's talk a few weeks ago, you might remember that he reminded us that the city of Jerusalem was a very strongly defended city. It was not an easy city to capture. So why did David feel he had to leave? Why did he leave this fortified city and flee into the wilderness? Well, I think it must be this. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. And betrayal does that, doesn't it? Betrayal, it's like a cancer. It spreads and infects so many areas of our life, doesn't it? Sometimes when people have been betrayed, they find they can't trust anyone anymore. So David has to flee to the wilderness because of Absalom's betrayal. I wonder if there's anyone here who's had to flee to a wilderness because of betrayal. And of course, this isn't just a political story, is it? This is a very personal story. It's a family tragedy, isn't it? Because David, he's not just betrayed by his advisors or even by his friends, it's his own son, isn't it, who betrays Absalom. Can't really imagine what that must be like. Although maybe there's someone here who knows all too well what that's like. You know, betrayal does have a really devastating effect on people, doesn't it? And if you've ever experienced betrayal, or perhaps you know people who have, you know, the Bible has much to say to help people who are in that situation. And the Bible's message is a message of hope and healing. You might look, for example, in Psalm 55, where David himself reflects on betrayal and really cries out to God in the midst of that. Well, they were some of the consequences of Absalom's betrayal of David. So let's move on to our second point, which is a history of betrayal. And let me ask you another question. Who betrayed David? Well, you might think that's an obvious answer. It's Absalom, isn't it? And of course that's true, but it's more complicated than that, isn't it? Because if you remember from the story and from the passages, some of David's closest advisors, they also joined the rebellion, didn't they? But from the beginning, do you remember at the beginning of chapter 15, Absalom, he courted the people of Israel, didn't he? Absalom, like a lot of leaders then and now perhaps, he knew how to play on people's grievances, their bitternesses, and maybe their hopes and dreams to get their support. And when Absalom finally begins his actual rebellion, do you remember in verse 13, it seemed like the whole people had gone after him. And you know, these are the people who David had led as king for many years. He'd defended them against their enemies. He'd established his capital in Jerusalem. He'd ruled for the most part wisely, justly, and in a godly way. And so the people's betrayal, it's really ungrateful and wicked, isn't it? But you know, in betraying David like this, the people are actually just continuing a long and sad history of betrayal. What do I mean by that? Well, do you remember what God said when the people first asked for a king? Back in 1 Samuel, when the people asked for a king, God says to Samuel, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me from being king over them. You know, Israel had rejected a far greater king than David. They'd rejected God. And their whole history was really a history of betraying God. Do you remember the golden calf? Do you remember the grumbling in the wilderness? Do you remember the constant worshipping of the idols of the nations around? You know, God is all too familiar with betrayal. And it didn't stop with Absalom. Long after King David's time, Israel continued to reject God's prophets, to worship false gods. I wonder, how long would you put up with betrayal? You know, how many chances would you give someone before you said, you know what, enough is enough? You know, I think when we think about Israel's betrayal of God down through the centuries, we really see how amazing God's patience and long suffering is. There's a verse in Psalm 86 that says, you, O Lord, are a God full of compassion and gracious, long suffering and abundant in mercy and truth. God really is a long-suffering God. But, you know, as we remember Israel's history of betrayal, let's remember that they stood for the whole human race. And if their history is a story of betrayal, well, so is the history of all human beings. You know, from the beginning, we've all betrayed and rejected God, and we continue to do so in our own lives. You know, what did Israel want when they looked to Absalom instead of David? They wanted peace, justice, security. They were the things God had promised to give them. And Israel, they wanted what God had to offer, but they didn't want God. And that's what we're all like, isn't it? We're all very happy to receive the good things God gives, but we certainly don't want God telling us how to live our lives. And that's a betrayal of God, just as the people betrayed David. So if you've ever experienced betrayal yourself, if you've ever seen close hand the pain of betrayal, well, you've seen just a little bit of what God experiences every day from me and from you. So let's think finally about betrayal's end. Absalom's story, well, it has a pretty sad end, doesn't it? Betrayal always does. You remember how David and his few faithful men, they're able, with God's help, to defeat Absalom's rebellion, aren't they? And Absalom himself, well, he comes to a fairly grisly end, doesn't he? He dies a pretty shameful death. It's certainly not a heroic death, despite, notice, how David wanted to show mercy. And maybe it seems when we get to the end of chapter 18 that the story's ended. But, you know, betrayal, it breeds mistrust and bitterness, doesn't it? And actually, if you were to go on and read chapters 19 and 20, actually you see that the rebellion that Absalom started continued, it grew, and in the end became a full-on civil war. And it took a long time, and it was a great cost before the people were finally restored back to David. And even then, as I say, their rejection of God continued. But, you know, through all of that, God remained faithful to them. And like David, God longed to show mercy to his rebellious children. And the wonderful thing is that in the fullness of time, he did. You know, it's, in case you haven't noticed, it's Christmas soon, isn't it? And at Christmas, we think about the coming of God into our midst as a man when Jesus was born. But, you know, when Jesus came as a man into our midst, what did he experience? Betrayal. This is what John says about Jesus. He was in the world was made through him, yet the world knew him not. He came to his own home, and his own people received him not. You know, the God who'd been rejected by man was now rejected as a man. And the whole of Jesus' human life was a life of rejection and suffering at the hands of his own people, the people he'd made. And, you know, in Jesus' life, it's like that whole sad history of man's betrayal of God is focused, it's intensified. And Jesus, he gathers it to himself until in the end, on the very night when the Son of God shared intimate fellowship with his close friends, he was betrayed by one of them. And at the very end, Jesus, he dies alone, doesn't he? He's abandoned by all his friends. He's rejected by everyone. And at the cross, human betrayal reached its darkest depth. And yet, that was God's purpose all along. God's purpose was to turn that very betrayal into the way of reconciliation. Jesus, he bore that terrible betrayal. He bore that so that we who betrayed him could be restored back to God, that we could be brought back like prodigal children to our Heavenly Father. So as we come to a close, let me ask you, have you experienced the kindness and the mercy of God? If you have, well, be very thankful. And let's seek to be faithful to him. You know, betrayal, it's not always spectacular like Absalom's. It's very easy to betray in small ways. And I can guarantee that tomorrow there'll be plenty of opportunities to betray God, perhaps in small ways. So let's ask him to help us to remain loyal to him. And if you've not experienced God's forgiveness, if you've not known that restoration, then let me make a final plea. How long are you going to continue to reject God? You know, Jesus said near the end of the Bible, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me." Won't you open the door? How long will you go on rejecting a God like this? You know, betrayal, it always has a tragic end. Won't you come to betrayal's end in the kindness and mercy of God? Well, we're going to sing our final song, and then after that I'll pray, and I'll also just mention a few things about the end of the service.